as fast moving as AI is, it does take months and even years to build the data centers, for example, that Trump was talking about at his White House meeting very early in his term about the so-called Stargate project with some of these big industry execs. Right? They're going to put hundreds of billions of dollars into building data centers.
Across the Biden administration and into the Trump administration, everyone recognizes AI is important. Everyone recognizes we need more compute, that we need to consider things like export controls for some of this compute.
Where is the US military in relation to where industry is on AI? So it's a cliche, but it's probably true that the industry leads in terms of tech developments versus the US government, right? US government doesn't build anything, it takes from industry. That certainly seems to be the case when it comes to artificial intelligence. Josh, in your estimation, where is the US military in relation to where industry is on AI?
Yeah, so, of course, as you alluded to, the maxim is true, again, in this case. The US government is acquiring things. And the reality in this particular case is just that, unlike perhaps some other defense and military systems, the commercial applications of a lot of these tools vastly outvalue the ones that are going into the Defense Department. The reality is that they're going to be acquiring LLMs from some of these providers and just trying to adjust them or rather contracting with them to basically fine-tune them for these particular applications. Right? This isn't a case of something like a fighter aircraft where sort of there's only one buyer for it. So the reality is that the private sector is far ahead. I think one of the things that we've seen in recent months is that DoD and CDAO in particular obviously recognize this. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts working with OpenAI, with Grok, with Anthropic. There's a clear recognition that a lot of this stuff is going to be acquired from industry, and you're going to be relying on industry expertise, not even just to actually produce it, but also to even test it, to evaluate it, and to prepare it for deployment.
It's tricky because historically, right, and to this day, the vast majority of DoD spending is driven by the armed services, not by the Central Office of Secretary of Defense, but the Army budget, the Navy Department, counting Navy and Marine Corps, the Air Force Department, which now includes Space Force, right? Those are where most of the money goes. And most of the procurement is driven by their requirements, which is an official term of art for long wish lists of technical stuff they want, whatever they're buying to do, right? And honestly, that approach of the long, detailed technical wish list has been a terrible fit for software in general, but particularly for AI, where things are changing so rapidly that your well-informed wish list from just 18 months ago may be completely irrelevant by the time you actually get the contract even signed. As Josh mentioned, they're signing these sort of open-ended contracts with things like OpenAI and XAI, sort of to play with frontier models at the department-wide level. That's where CDAO comes in. Now these are being folded under one of the four major undersecretaries. It's very in flux. I know from the people I've talked to, there's a lot of concern this amounts to a demotion of AI, that amounts to top leadership taking their eye off this ball when there's still a lot in play, and when the services which drive the budget haven't fully gone digital, haven't fully gone digital native yet.
Josh, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, so I think that as long as the responsibilities are preserved within CDAO, as long as their sort of authority as a central body for providing best practices, for providing funding for experimentation, doing a lot of work on CJAD-C2 as an example, I think as long as those things are preserved, right, at the end of the day, the hierarchy doesn't necessarily matter in this case.
So we had an AI order from President Trump, which was federal-wide. It wasn't just DoD, though there were DoD parts in there. That was seen in some quarters as, look, like we're getting serious about AI now. Like the president's saying this is a national priority. Based on the language, which obviously can change and be understood differently over time, do you feel like this is maybe a watershed moment, or do you think this is just another step in the kind of evolving relationship between the government and the AI industry?
It's so hard to say because as fast moving as AI is, it does take months and even years to build the data centers, for example, that Trump was talking about at his White House meeting very early in his term about the so-called Stargate project with some of these big industry execs. Right? They're going to put hundreds of billions of dollars into building data centers. Those aren't going to be online for a while, even if they actually start work right away. There's a lot of interest at the top levels of the administration in AI, and it's all about going faster and competing with China. Whereas under Biden, it was much more about, we need to go faster on AI, but also, have guidelines and guardrails and, international norms and standards, all of which that part has been sort of tossed in favor of go fast, compete with China. We won't know what fruits that approach will bear until at least sometime in 2026.
Yeah, and I would also just add to what Sydney's saying. I think a lot of the change we've seen is, across the Biden administration and into the Trump administration, everyone recognizes AI is important. Everyone recognizes we need more compute, that we need to consider things like export controls for some of this compute as an example, right? That we want to maintain ourselves as a world leader in AI, and that we want to sort of spread our model for developing these systems around the world. I think really the biggest difference, the biggest piece is this sort of culture wars, this woke AI piece, which is sort of interesting and funny to me, I will say, because as we were talking about, we are expecting that a lot of these systems in the DoD case in particular, LLMs in particular, are going to be acquired and adapted from commercial industry, where it is still very important to develop these with an eye towards bias, responsible use, avoiding things like radicalization, sycophancy, misinformation. So the degree to which that's really going to have an impact, especially on their commercial development, and then adapting that into DoD, I would be very curious to see the degree to which that's really going to be sort of enforceable or realistic when we're talking about, a slim part of the business model of a lot of these companies.
What does the department need to do to get these companies to do what they need?
Yeah, so I think one thing that particularly stands out to me is we've seen a lot of deployments of even the same tools that are being acquired using operational funds from some of the COCOMs that are being deployed by them separately. And this isn't necessarily being grouped together as one buy or as one development effort. I think trying to harmonize things across AORs is probably valuable. And I'm thinking of things like the Maven Smart system, where we've seen, CENTCOM has its own instance, EUCOM has its own instance, and INDOPACOM has its own instance. And the degree to which those are necessarily going to be able to talk to each other and work together hasn't necessarily been made clear. So I think one of the things is the department focusing maybe less on these really small scale, rapid experimentation in one specific area, and starting to ask the question about what kinds of tools and systems are going to need to acquire across services, across the department, where it's really going to matter that they can talk to each other, especially if you're trying to, establish something like actually achieving your CJAD C2 goal.
It's pretty clear just from the corporate world, with this recent MIT report, it said 95% of corporate AI pilots never return on investment, right? They don't make any money back. They in fact, lose money. That just saying, "Oh, look, we have AI," and slapping it on things, like the Gemini feature in Microsoft Outlook or whatever the hell it is, right? That doesn't really get people anywhere. That what you actually need is to combine the power of these foundational models, these big general purpose algorithms, with specifically knowing what the heck the job at hand is, what's called domain expertise, right? That you need to have not just the software engineer and the data scientist, you also need the specialist in the job you're actually trying to do, be that logistics across the Pacific, be that navigating a ground vehicle through broken terrain, be that planning a series of airstrikes, or the refueling, mid-air refueling of aircraft. You need that person to tell you how it actually needs to work in reality, so that these big AI engines actually are trained on the right data and are customized to the right specific problem, as opposed to being this very blunt, one size fits all. Oh, everything is a nail because all I have is a hammer kind of approach. And that actually, kind of splits the difference that Josh was talking about. That you can actually have the big fundamental models coming in from industry, but then you train that instance or you customize, an interface on top of it, or a set of tools on top of it that are for that specific task and that specific function.
I would also say that really means that the department's going to be pretty reliant on these vendors to be able to provide sort of evaluations, sort of proof that they've put guardrails in place to protect against some of the concerns that you might have with employing these systems. And so that's going to be one thing going forward, working with industry, is figuring out what those best practices are, figuring out how you require them. I think there's a lot of hay that sometimes gets made, and especially in the transition between administrations, that sort of responsible AI is slowing us down, that it's bad for us. But there's also sort of a recognition that trust is incredibly important here. And we are in a very high-risk domain, which is different from a lot of the other applications of these systems. And so building that trust piece requires, sharing best practices with industry, learning from them, figuring out ways to evaluate these systems, and to build up as much assurance as you can ahead of time before you actually deploy them.